dive briefing on day 2, and it's looking to like just 3 dives today because there's going to be a shore excursion.
And unlike most of the dive sites around here, it's got an interesting name, and I have no idea why they named it Chicken Tree, and quite a bit of fish life.
When we booked this trip, I'd been really curious how the Ilike was going to handle the logistics of getting divers on and off the dive deck, considering it was up front 10 feet from the water line. As it turns out, they had a really smooth operation that basically hinged on the crew doing a ton of work for us. When it was our group's turn in the rotation, we went out to the dive deck and put on our wetsuits, if we were wearing any. Crew would then grab our BCs, which were already on tanks, and then carry them over to the boat, negotiating the stairs and the occasional tricky step over into the dinghy. We'd then follow behind with just our masks, camera, and dive computers, and our fins were kept on the dinghy between dives. When we were all aboard and seated on the dinghy and had verified we had everything, the dinghy would go a short distance to the dive site, at which point the guide would do a current check and determine where we were going to jump in. We then get helped into our BCs by the dinghy driver and the guide, put on our fins, and after getting a signal from our guide, back roll off the boat. One of the things that Raja is known for is currents running through the dive sites. Current can add a significant amount of difficulty, stress, and even a bit of danger to a dive depending how strong they are and what the direction is. Part of the initial safety briefing had actually involved reviewing what to do if you were caught in a down current that was threatening to pull you into the deep. Here they were fairly mild, but it was a sign of things to come. Jen and I have done a fair amount of diving at this point, so we've dealt with current. It can even be a lot of fun when you're just going with it, drifting along, and it feels like you're just flying along the reef. The problem is I tend to burn through the gas in my tank significantly faster whenever I have to kick against it to try and stay with the group. Also, I do have a little bit of residual anxiety around current dives after some less than great events I got exposed to years ago, but that's a whole different story. We did come across this really cool event right at the end of the dive. Just as we were finishing up our safety stop, we noticed there were a number of reef sharks circling around in the shallows. That was remarkable enough, and when we got closer, we saw a big Napoleon wrasse come up hunting something under a rock. It managed to flip the rock over, which then triggered the sharks to go into attack mode, and we got to witness this rolling battle between the huge wrasse and medium-sized sharks. Sadly, it was too far away to really capture well, but it was enough of a, event. We stretched our remaining air as long as we possibly could before we came back to the surface. day 2, and things have been going a little bit smoother so far. Other than I got a partial tank fill on that one, so I had to not breathe much and be up higher.
Hey, Matt.
Works better if you hit record. Pro tip.
Morning dive just absolutely blew us away. Big schools of fish, colorful reefs, and a spectacular finish with the sharks and the Napoleon wrasse.
And the Napoleon wrasse shoved a rock out of the way to get at something, and then the sharks went, "Screw you, that's our rock." And the sharks like chased it off, and it was an ongoing fight. And she had the camera and was just like...
Well, I felt like I had been videoing the sharks for so long, and eventually I turned it off. And of course, right after I turned it off,
5 sharks.
that's when the excitement happened.
I mean, clownfish she'll record for hours, but sharks.
Okay, last dive, I was not recording any anemone fish. I saw a couple, but I'm like, okay, they're the same as the last dive. I'm not going to record them. But then you showed me those 2 in the white bubble tip, and that was just so perfect.
They were big honky guys.
I did get a little video of that one's in the white bubble tip.
Record whatever makes you happy.
After breakfast, the boat moved over to our next dive site. This is the Sawandarek village, and there were a couple boats over here, but looks like they're moving off, so we should have this nice, peaceful, lovely spot to our shellfish.
So we moved along the south coast of those 2 islands, from Sardine, past Crete, all the way across Crete Island.
This guide is feeding the fish, which is something that is generally considered a bad thing to do. Sadly, there isn't a lot of enforcement underwater unless the guide operations report them. The main claim to fame of this dive site was the shallows, and specifically the pier. There was originally a different pier here, which we were told had appeared worldwide in advertisements for Raja due to all the life encrusting it. But then a storm came through, it fell down, and they had to replace it with a new pier. It's still a really, really cool dive, but it hasn't had enough time to fully grow back in yet. The shallow dive in the protected bay did make for satisfyingly clear water, even if the number of groups roaming around was a bit more crowded feeling than we usually prefer. Clement had mentioned during the briefing that there was a giant clam out here. When we came to it, I actually didn't realize it was a clam at first. I thought it was some sort of algae or a rock, it was so big. And the group managed to find a good number of really, really cuddly anemone fish for taters. And then there was Tater's other favorite thing, turtles. Sea turtles do have to go to the surface to breathe, but they can hold their breath for hours at a time, so we'll often find them just sleeping on the coral or generally hanging out down there. Or, in some cases, scratching themselves. This guy was kind of funny. I've seen turtles scratching themselves on corals before. I think we had a good shot of it in Bonaire, actually. He's actually scratching himself on something called fire coral, though, which is notorious because if you touch it, you're going to be in pain literally for months. Didn't seem to bother him, though. We spent a little bit of time way down at 90 feet because there was actually this big group of sweet lips down there and some schools of other fish. And as usual, the shallows were just spectacular. This is the first time we were the first group back, so we got first pick of food. As I mentioned earlier, the original plan had been to do an evening shore excursion after the third dive, but when a storm blew in around lunch, we ended up changing plans and going in search of a site that was more sheltered.
Many mangroves, the roots come down and the bottom comes up, and it's all completely choked up with the roots.
It was still raining as we were getting ready and ferrying out to the dive site. Diving in the rain is something I love, whenever I'm not in Southern California where you have to worry about runoff pollution. Just because when you're underwater, you look up and you see this kind of glass ceiling with the raindrops hitting all around you. And it's not like you have to worry about getting your gear wet or anything. This dive site was notable as it was adjacent to a mangrove area. While we'd kind of snorkeled around mangroves in Bon Air, it had been short, the viz was bad, and the whole experience was kind of a bit too much on the touristy side for us. This was a far superior experience with a look into the mangrove shallows with good visibility, and then afterwards we were able to go on a proper dive further down the slope. Along with the pier dive earlier today, this was actually one of the more memorable dives in a trip that was filled with a lot of those. While neither of us are the biggest fan of diving around a lot of other people, it does help you see things you'd otherwise miss. Cuttlefish are another thing that Jen gets really excited about. This one was a cool find, especially during the day, but it actually took a minute for us to repeatedly gesture at it before she realized what she was seeing. This was also the trip where we found out the dinghies can technically hold 2 full trips of divers, though it was a little on the snug side. So sadly, due to conditions, our night dive is canceled, so we've got an easier night tonight. But Oh well, more tomorrow. It was a little bit of a bummer to feel like we were missing out on a dive this early in the trip, before the full body exhaustion had really set in, but hey, it happens.